Welcome to Therapy in the Great Outdoors, the podcast where we explore the business and practice of nature-based pediatric therapy of all kinds. If you're an outdoor-loving pediatric practitioner in the fields of occupational, physical, or speech therapy, social work, or mental health, this podcast will help you start and grow a successful nature-based practice or program. I am the ever honest, always 100% real, you'll hear it all on this podcast, Dr. Laura Park Figueroa. I'm a pediatric OT with over 20 years of experience, and I run a thriving nature-based practice with profitable locations in 2 different states and multi-six figures in revenue. I also host the free online community at therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com to help you pursue your nature-based therapy dreams too. Are you ready to take action on those dreams? Let's jump in. Hello, welcome to Therapy in the Great Outdoors. Today we are going to talk about attention restoration theory. I really thought that I had done an episode on this topic a long time ago, and when I went back through all of the episodes, I realized that I've never spoken about it for a specific episode. I'm sure I've mentioned it on other episodes, but it is probably the most well-known theory in the nature-based pediatric therapy space. And because I hear other nature-based pediatric therapists mention this and how it influences their work. So today I want to give you a brief primer on it. Now, there are whole books and loads of articles written about it. So this will not be an extensive, you won't be an expert after listening to one podcast, but I hope you knew that anyway. So you have to go deeper into the literature and deeper into understanding things to really become an expert on them. But I studied this theory a lot during my PhD and in my dissertation. So it really is something that can directly influence the decisions we make in our nature-based practices with children. So in this episode, I am going to review the 4 different components of the theory, as well as share some direct quotes from the original book that the authors wrote about attention restoration theory. So I'm a little embarrassed and also at the same time a little proud. I don't even know if that's possible to be both of those at the same time, but I paid $89 for an original copy of the book by Stephen and Rachel Kaplan, the founders of this theory. The book is called The Experience of Nature, A Psychological Perspective. And it is like, when I just looked before I recorded this podcast, the cheapest one you could get now is $177. It was published in 1989. And so it's a book about this theory and about the research that the theory is based upon. So I'm going to share with you some quotes from that book. This book is, honestly, y'all, I haven't even read it cover to cover, but it is one of my most cherished possessions in my, I was going to say arsenal of books. It's a weird word to use as a nature-based therapist. Maybe my garden of books that I have about nature-based work. So I just love this book, and I hope you'll enjoy hearing the words of the original authors of the theory as we go along in this episode. Okay, so what is attention restoration theory? I'm going to give you my kind of quick view of it first, and then you'll get a little more nuance as we read some of the quotes from the book. Attention restoration theory by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan in the late 1980s is the theory that nature is the optimal place to restore human attention. The authors propose that we have 2 systems of attention in our human brains. We have directed attention and we have soft fascination. So those can be, those 2 kind of general kinds of attention can basically be described as the directed attention is basically our frontal lobes, executive function. When we have to really focus cognitively to do something. In the last episode where I mentioned attention restoration theory, I give the example of taxes, where for most of us, unless you're an accountant and you love doing taxes, for most of us, doing taxes is something that we procrastinate on. We put it off. When we're doing it, it tends to hurt our brain a little bit. And we have to really force ourselves. We have to direct our attention towards that activity in order to get it done. Attention restoration theory basically states that directed attention is limited. We all know that we have a limited capacity to focus our attention on something throughout the day, and that we need to take breaks in order to restore our attention, as the theory states. The theory itself states that the place that is optimal to restore our directed attention is in nature and outdoor settings, because nature facilitates, it naturally elicits that soft fascination. When you go outdoors in nature, if you're noticing it, if you're attuned to it and looking at nature and like observing the nature around you and consciously noticing those things, you naturally are going to be fascinated by something. And when you go outside, almost any time that you go outside, you can be fascinated by something. And so there are all these things in nature that elicit this soft fascination where our directed attention system, our frontal lobes of our brain, have the ability to rest, and we just are naturally fascinated or naturally intrigued by things that are in the outdoor world. That is the gist, the very basics, and I don't consider myself an expert on this theory, but that's just the gist of the theory. So I'm going to read for you here just a short section out of the book that talks about the nuances of this, because I explained it very simply, but when you read what they write about this theory, it is so beautifully written in a way that I cannot communicate to you all. Here is a quote about the restorative environment of nature. The nervous system seems to be structured in such a way that pleasure and pain tend to inhibit each other. Thus, the experience of pleasure tends to reduce or eliminate pain. The implications of this property of the nervous system are profound. Because contact with pleasurable stimuli can control pain, it should be possible to confront uncertainty and confusion in environments that are experienced as pleasurable. Further, the experience of pleasure should reduce the need for directed attention. Thus, this molecular explanation achieves what is desired at the functional level, namely that environments that are preferred and hence experienced as safe permit resting one's directed attention. A preferred environment is thus more likely to be a restorative environment. And since nature plays such a powerful role in what is preferred, in general terms, there is a theoretical basis for expecting natural environments to be restorative. So that is from page 189 in The Experience of Nature by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. So much to unpack here. It is just such a beautiful description of how the nature environment affects our nervous system. And I love how they talk about pleasure and pain tend to inhibit one another. And thinking about the children that we see for therapy, this is an interesting thing to think about, because if children are enjoying the experience of being outdoors, then we have a lower need for directed attention and restoration of their attention, because we're eliciting that soft fascination. And I also would like to point out, a lot of times you will hear as a nature-loving pediatric therapist that, quote, no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing, which I do think is true. And we do have that philosophy in my own practice and my own work. I have that philosophy that we should be getting kids outdoors in all kinds of weather. But I also found in my own research when I did my PhD that the therapist said sometimes that they wondered about quote unquote bad weather. If it's very cold or very wet and rainy or very windy, they wondered if those experiences might sometimes prohibit work on goals or detract from the work on goals, because you're just trying to get through the session, essentially. And so this quote from the Attention Restoration Theory book actually supports that idea of thinking about, as pediatric therapists, we should be thinking about the influence the environment will have on the children that we serve. So I don't want to say that we should only have therapy outdoors if it's, quote, nice weather, 70 degrees and sunny or whatever. But I do think that we need to consider, of course, the children that we're serving and how the outdoor environment may promote or detract from work on the goals, the therapy goals that we have with the children. Okay, let's talk about now the 4 different components of attention restoration theory. So the first one is being away. So feeling away from the stressors of daily life and the built environment. So that is one of the first components of a restorative environment according to attention restoration theory. Does it feel away from daily life? From the book, also on page 189, they say psychologically, being away implies involving oneself in cognitive content different from the usual. This is what makes our therapy sessions so engaging for children, is that it's different than what they know in a typical therapy setting or a typical school setting, unless you serve kids that go to forest school or outdoor school. So maybe they're used to that. But yeah, the being away just means that you choose a nature environment that is set away from built environments. So I personally try to choose environments that do not have a playground structure or have a house or any buildings nearby or roads nearby that you can see. But that can be hard in urban environments. And none of the places that I do therapy in my practice are wilderness settings. They're not national parks or anything like that. They are local parks, but it's important to think about this feeling of being away because it does, I think, lend to the restorativeness of the environment for the children in your services. The second component of a restorative nature environment is extent. So EXTENT. And this is the feeling of a whole other world. In the book, they talk about extent promising a continuation of the world beyond what is immediately perceived. That's page 190. It relates to the feeling of being away, but they also suggest that extent is, I think about it like vastness. Does it feel like there is just this hopefulness of opportunities in the environment where you're doing therapy? They also define extent as a sense of connectedness to the broader scope of the larger world. So that's something else to think about in the space that you're choosing for therapy for kids. The third component is compatibility. So is there compatibility between the features of the natural environment, of the nature environment, and the goals of your session? So essentially, they don't necessarily say it this way in the book, but they basically are looking at compatibility between the features of the nature environment and whatever your goals are for going there. In the book on page 193, they state, functioning in a natural setting seems for many people to be less effortful than functioning in more, quote, civilized settings, even though their familiarity with the latter is far greater. It's hard to avoid the conjecture that the fact that humans evolved in environments far more natural than those in which we live now has something to do with this special resonance. The compatibility piece, they are talking more about humans being compatible with the natural world. But like I just said, I think as pediatric therapists, we should be thinking about compatibility between the features of the environment that we're using for therapy and the children's preferences and their therapy goals. All right, and the last component is fascination. So does the environment that you are doing therapy in inspire fascination? This to me means like opportunities for meaningful learning to help children make connections to their understanding of the larger world. In the book, on page 192, they state, there is a large supply of fascinating objects. namely the fellow creatures that share the planet with us. There are also processes that people tend to find fascinating, such as growth, succession, predation, and even survival itself. Settings that encourage soft fascination have two aspects in common. First, the involuntary aspect is of only modest strength. Second, there seems to be an important aesthetic component involved. Soft fascination can be a mix of fascination and pleasure, such that any lack of clarity an individual may be experiencing is not necessarily blotted out by distraction, but rendered substantially less painful. This would make possible the simultaneous exploration of other thoughts, including confusing material that's been made tolerable by the presence of pleasurable stimuli. So this is getting really heady here, but basically what they're going back to is this idea that the outdoor setting can involuntarily elicit that soft fascination and give space, I think, for understanding things that are a little more confusing to us as humans. And then the second piece of there seems to be an important aesthetic component involved. This is a huge thing for me. I am really big on aesthetics. I don't like to use a lot of plastic in treatment. I like the aesthetic feel of a session to feel different than the child's everyday life. And so when we are outdoors and using natural materials in our sessions, there is that concept of aesthetics. Like things are generally beautiful in some way, even when things are muddy. When I see a kid covered in mud, I think that's beautiful. So maybe we need to change our definition of beautiful a little bit with the way I'm thinking of it. But yeah, the aesthetic piece is something too. So they say in the book, the attention holding power of the garden was one of the most highly rated benefits in both garden studies that they did. The nearby environment is probably particularly strong in soft fascination. The play of light on foliage, the patterns created by long shadows, the different moods of a nature oasis with changes in weather and season, all combine aesthetics and interest in a way that leaves room in the mind for other thoughts as well. So that is it. Again, the four components of a restorative environment are: does it feel away? Does it offer extent and expansiveness? Is there compatibility between what your goals are and the environment? And does it inspire fascination? So the takeaways for us here as nature-based therapists, I think, are to consider these things when we are choosing an environment for therapy. And so I hope that this episode gave you a little bit of food for thought. And if you want to talk more about this topic or have questions about attention restoration theory, every single week for the podcast, we put a post inside of the Therapy in the Great Outdoors community. So anytime you have a question or comment on anything that I talk about on the podcast, you are so welcome to go there and share your thoughts and your expertise with other people in our nature-based therapist community there. So I hope this helped you, and I'll see you next week. Bye. Wait a second. Don't go yet. Do you want 120 ways that you can take your pediatric therapy work outdoors into nature? I wrote the free, big, huge list of nature-based therapy activities just for you. The Big Huge List will give you quick ideas for nature-based sessions. In the Big Huge List, there are activities for gross motor, fine motor, visual perceptual, executive function, balance, group collaboration and team building, social, emotional, and self-regulation skills, as well as speech and language, and a whole section just for swing activities. So go on and get your free Big Huge List so you can get started taking kids outdoors or have some new ideas if you've been doing this a while. You can download your free copy at therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com/list. So until next time, get outside, connect, reflect, and enjoy therapy in the great outdoors.